Hello everyone and welcome to another recorded lecture of BIO1 online. Today we will talk about chapter 5, which is on photosynthesis. So to refresh your memory from the very beginning, organisms can be one of two kinds. We have autotrophs, which can produce their own energy. Since they can produce their own energy, we call them producers. They're self-feeders. So they can use inorganic substances like water and carbon dioxide to produce their own food. Heterotrophs, like us, other animals, many fungi, and other microorganisms, must consume other organisms for energy. So we are consumers. But at the very end of the day, all of us, whether you are a heterotroph or an autotroph, rely on energy from the sun, right? All of us, the entire food chain, relies on the energy from the sun. So autotrophs, which are producers, carry out photosynthesis. And it's not just plants that do photosynthesis. Actually, most of the photosynthesis occurs in the ocean. So cyanobacteria are types of bacteria that can do photosynthesis in the water. Eukaryotes like algae and plants carry out photosynthesis in the water and on land. So we see photosynthesis in both domain bacteria and eukarya. No archaea are known to carry out photosynthesis at all. But again, you should understand the differences between the locations. Mostly, like I want you to know where would a bacteria do photosynthesis versus where would a plant cell do photosynthesis, right? You should know that big difference. For most of this talk, we're going to just talk about plant photosynthesis. So let's really focus on photosynthesis in plants. And what happens in plants is that they capture solar energy from the sun, and they could produce chemical energy from that. So they could basically just act like a solar panel, just absorb all the sun's energy and then turn that energy into carbohydrates. And they could use the carbohydrates as food. And the way this is happening is because energy from the sun is used to form bonds between very low energy molecules like water and carbon dioxide to create very high energy molecules like glucose. So the energy has to come from somewhere, right? If we're getting smaller things, low energy things, and building them up into high energy things, we need an input of energy. And of course, that's where the sun comes in. And plants can't directly absorb energy from the sun without chlorophyll. Chlorophyll is a special pigment molecule that can absorb and store solar energy. And plants' chlorophyll is located in the chloroplasts. Chlorophyll has electrons that can be excited when sunlight hits it at a certain wavelength. And when these electrons are excited, they can be used to reduce carbon dioxide into carbohydrates. Right? If you recall, reduction is the gain of electrons. So we're basically adding electrons to CO2 to add more energy, and we're reducing it into carbohydrates. Carbohydrates like glucose can then be used to provide the cell with ATP. And of course, this whole thing of photosynthesis is an endergonic process. We're using energy to build things, right? We're using energy from the sun to build bigger things. So this is an anabolic and endergonic process. So we said that sunlight powers photosynthesis, and photosynthesis will produce glucose and oxygen for us. So plants are pretty easy to grow because all you need to do is give them enough carbon dioxide, water, and light, and they will produce glucose, C6H12O6, and oxygen. So with these three ingredients, we can grow a plant. So how can plants do so much with such simple raw materials? Photosynthesis is an incredibly efficient process. Each year, autotrophs around the world produce up to 200 billion metric tons of sugar. That's almost impossible to conceive with the human brain, but that would be not one Empire State Building of sugar cubes. So right now, just imagine this Empire State Building made of sugar cubes. And now, so there's one made of sugar cubes. Now imagine 2 million of those. That's how much sugar is produced every year by autotrophs on this planet. So this is an incredibly efficient process. And photosynthesis of the past actually fuels our present. So we have energy from fossil fuels and coal. But coal and fossil fuels have their energy from plants and other organisms that lived hundreds of millions of years ago. So photosynthesis hundreds of millions of years ago basically took energy from the sun and stored it in organisms, and that accumulated over time and turned into coal and oil and gas. So the oil, gas, and coal that we use today were photosynthetic organisms of the past, and that's why they're called fossil fuels. So we all depend on photosynthesis. All organisms rely on photosynthesis to survive because we need their fruits, seeds, leaves, roots, pollen, nectar, and flowers. And so all organisms, with some exceptions, I don't want to say all organisms use plants, but most heterotrophs rely on plant products to survive. And not only that, but oxygen is released as a waste product of photosynthesis, and most life on Earth depends on oxygen to produce ATP for energy. So oxygen is a waste product that we depend on, and we're going to talk a lot more about that in the next chapter. But this is illustrating just how important photosynthesis is. Maybe it's not the most exciting topic to learn about, but it's incredibly important. So I'll pause here and answer this rapid response question. So the answer to this question is B, right? Photosynthesis is evolutionarily advantageous because it allows organisms to make their own food rather than find it. So in plants, leaves are the main organs of photosynthesis, right? That very broad, flat surfaces so they can be exposed to the sunlight and maximizes their surface area. So a tree has many broad, flat leaves so it can absorb as much solar energy as possible and then deliver it to all of its other cells that are not necessarily doing photosynthesis. So in the green plants, the leaf tissue is called mesophyll. And then within a mesophyll cell, we have abundant chloroplasts. So here we have a large central vacuole in this mesophyll cell, but we also have chloroplasts, and those are quite large. And let's look at the structure of a chloroplast a little more closely. So chloroplasts are the organelles of photosynthesis in plants and algae. Most photosynthetic cells can have up to 200 chloroplasts. So again, we have a lot of photosynthesis going on. The structure of a chloroplast is as follows. We have two membranes, an outer membrane and an inner membrane, but also technically a third type of membrane called the thylakoid membrane. And thylakoids are little discs. They're membranous discs that are studded with pigments that can absorb energy from the sun. So chlorophyll, for example, is found in these thylakoid membranes. So the thylakoid space is a little compartment enclosed by the membrane, but the membrane itself is where the chlorophyll is found. Chlorophyll is specifically found in what are called photosystems. So photosystems are pigments plus associated proteins that could participate in photosynthesis. So again, we have these stacks of thylakoids. Each stack is called a granum. So here we have a single granum. So thylakoids are arranged in stacks. And the space outside of all the grana is called a stroma. That's the chloroplast fluid inner region. That's where we also find ribosomes, DNA, and the enzymes required to make sugar. So you should definitely be familiar with the structure of a chloroplast. So now let's talk about the three ingredients that all plants need in order to get sugar, right? We need to get sugar so then we can make ATP. So how do we make sugar? We need three ingredients. We need carbon dioxide, the sun, and water. So let's talk about the first ingredient, carbon dioxide. How do plants get carbon dioxide? Well, CO2 is all around our environment. And plants actually have little pores on their underside called stomata. Singular is a stoma. So these are tiny openings in the epidermis of a leaf or a stem, and that allows for gas exchange, allowing plants to inhale carbon dioxide from the environment and then to exhale, quote unquote, oxygen. So the problem is a plant could also lose too much water out of the stomata. So there are special cells that can actually surround each stoma and prevent them from opening unless they need to. So stomata help balance the need of gas exchange and water conservation. right? And stoma is a singular, right? Stomata is plural. So the second ingredient is water. And how do plants get water? Well, from rain. And roots can absorb water from the earth that can move up vascular tissue of plants and then deliver the water to the mesophyll cells where photosynthesis occurs. Ingredient number 3 is sunlight. So how do plants get energy from the sun in photosynthesis? The sun emits energy in waves of photons, which are little packets of kinetic energy. And a photon's wavelength is the distance it moves during a complete vibration. And the shorter a photon's wavelength, the more energy it contains. So shorter wavelengths have higher energy than longer wavelengths. And while the sun radiates a full spectrum of radiation called the electromagnetic spectrum, only a very small portion of it could actually reach Earth's surfaces. So there are 3 main components of sunlight that could reach Earth's surface. There's UV light, visible light, and IR radiation. So UV radiation is actually very damaging. It's very high energy. It could damage our DNA and cause cancer. So UV light is not very useful to biological processes. And then IR is much lower energy, but again, it doesn't have enough energy to really power anything in biology. So most of the energy is converted immediately to heat. So that leaves us with visible light. Right? So visible light is what plants can capture in order to power photosynthesis. Right? And we perceive visible light of different wavelengths as distinct colors. Right? So these are the colors that our human eyes can perceive. And pigments, like chlorophyll, are molecules that can capture energy from light. And each pigment specializes in absorbing energy from a particular wavelength of light. So plant cells contain several pigment molecules that capture light energy of different wavelengths. The most abundant chlorophyll A is a photosynthetic pigment in plants, algae, and cyanobacteria. But photosynthetic organisms also have accessory pigments that can use other wavelengths of light as well. So we're just like maximizing the amount of energy we can absorb from the sun. So photosynthetic pigments have distinct colors because they absorb only some wavelengths of visible light while reflecting others. So for example, let's look at chlorophyll A. Chlorophyll A and also chlorophyll B can absorb wavelengths of blue and red light. And so that means they can use that kind of light, right? But the leaf pigments cannot use green light, right? The wavelength of light is just not doing it. It can't activate the pigments. So green light is reflected. And that is why we perceive leaves to be green, because they reflect green light. Carotenoids are another type of pigment that reflect longer wavelengths of light. So they tend to appear red and orange. Those are what make carrots orange and tomatoes red, for example. So only absorbed light is useful in photosynthesis. Accessory pigments can absorb wavelengths that chlorophyll A cannot. So again, we're just extending the range of light wavelengths that a cell can harness for photosynthesis. Let's watch a quick video about that now.
In order for plants to grow, they need inputs of carbon dioxide, water, and energy. The chemical process by which plants use these resources to manufacture glucose, the building blocks of plants, is called photosynthesis. In the process, oxygen gas is produced as a byproduct. The energy for photosynthesis originates in the sun and arrives at the earth as sunlight. This light has both a wave and a particle nature. The particles, or photons, are the smallest units of light. Photons oscillate along a path, which is measured as wavelengths. The light emitted from the sun contains photons in a wide spectrum of wavelengths, called the electromagnetic spectrum. Photosynthetic organisms use only a small portion of the electromagnetic spectrum, called visible light. Photosynthetic organisms contain pigments that facilitate the capture of wavelengths of light in the visible light range. The color of the pigment comes from the wavelengths of light reflected. Plants appear green because they reflect yellow and green wavelengths of light. Red and blue wavelengths of light are absorbed by these pigments and provide the energy that is used for photosynthesis.
So pause here and try to answer this rapid response question. So the answer is C. So pigments such as chlorophyll are found in photosystems. And a photosystem is a large protein structure embedded in the thylakoid membrane that contains pigments. We'll talk about two specific photosystems when we talk about photosynthesis, photosystem 1 and photosystem 2. They both contain antenna pigments and a reaction center that contains chlorophyll. So a photosystem reaction center includes the special chlorophyll A molecule that can actually use the energy in photosynthesis. And this is what chlorophyll looks like. These antenna pigments are other molecules that can also capture photon energy from the sun, but they kind of funnel it. They, like an antenna, they just transfer all that energy they absorb to the reaction center. So the reaction center, chlorophyll has a pair of electrons that are excited by certain wavelengths of light from the sun. So again, each photosystem only has a few hundred chlorophyll molecules, but a single chlorophyll A molecule with its antenna pigments all around it can then absorb tons of energy and be very, very efficient. So the antenna pigments, again, like antennas do, maximize the absorption of energy from the sun, so we can excite a special pair of electrons in this reaction center chlorophyll. So that's what we're trying to do. We're exciting electrons. So what does that mean? These electrons in chlorophyll are low energy, but when we add sunlight to them, they can become higher energy. We know that high energy things are very unstable. So once they're higher energy, we want to capture some of that energy from the excited electrons of chlorophyll. So you can think about the excited electrons in chlorophyll as hot coals, right? They have a lot of potential to do something. You could cook something with it, but it's very unstable. It's not easy to hold on to. But we want to use some of that energy. We just took the energy from the sun and we excited some electrons in chlorophyll. So now let's try to capture that energy from chlorophyll somehow. So NADP plus is a special cofactor that can carry energy, almost like an empty battery does. So NADP plus can be reduced, meaning it can gain electrons, also hydrogen, right? And that can be a fully charged battery. So you could think about it like, remember the hot coals were the electrons. The NADP plus is like a pan where you can hold onto the electrons and then drop them off somewhere else where they're needed. So this is an energy carrier. NADP plus is an energy carrier that can carry energized electrons. And again, the electrons come from the reaction center chlorophyll in the photosystems. Another way to look at it is like the electrons are a hot potato. And again, a hot potato has energy in it, but it's not really, you want to hold on to it somehow. So we need an NADP plus oven mitt to hold on to it. And then together we can then transfer the energy in those excited electrons to where it's needed. And we spoke about reduction and oxidation in the last lecture. So you could pause here and just make sure you understand what we mean when we talk about a redox reaction. Because what we're seeing is that carbon dioxide is gaining electrons and becoming glucose. So again, reduction is an anabolic process. We're building something. But at the same time, water is losing electrons and is being oxidized or broken down into oxygen. So photosynthesis is a redox reaction, and it's very much tied into respiration, what we'll talk about later. So to recap, in photosynthesis, plants want to capture solar energy from the sun to make chemical energy as glucose. Cellular energy will then convert the chemical energy from glucose into ATP. Right? ATP can then be used for all the metabolic processes a cell needs. So what we're doing now, again, is we're taking solar energy, So we can make higher energy bonds between carbon dioxide and build it up into a higher energy glucose that can then be used to make ATP for the cell. So we're going to talk about photosynthesis now, step by step. Photosynthesis can be broken down into two major steps. The first is called the light reactions. The second is called the carbon reactions. The light reactions are the photo part, so light. The carbon reactions, also known as the Calvin cycle, is the synthesis part. So the light reactions will convert solar energy to chemical energy. And then in the carbon reactions, they're not using light directly, but they're going to do a lot of the reactions to actually build glucose, build sugars, using carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And that's why they're called carbon reactions. They're building carbon dioxide into sugar. So in the learning map, you'll see a table that looks like this. And this is what I want you to know at the very minimum. For each, the light reaction and the carbon cycle, know where it's happening in the chloroplast, what's the main goal, what are the inputs, like what goes in, and then what comes out, what are the outputs, and then what are the major proteins and enzymes involved in each step. So it would be helpful to maybe keep a blank table like this in your notes and try to fill it out as we go along in this lecture. The learning map also has this diagram that's blank. And again, try your best to fill it out from memory after this lecture to test your knowledge and to see if you have to go back in the book and read it again. So this is a very simple diagram of the light reactions. So at the very least, you should be able to describe what's happening at each step. So before we talk about photosynthesis in detail, let's just watch a quick overview video.
Within eukaryotic photosynthetic organisms, also known as photoautotrophs, the chemical reactions of photosynthesis occur within plant cells in specialized structures known as chloroplasts. Photosynthesis consists of two sets of reactions, the light-dependent reactions and the Calvin cycle. Within the chloroplast are small disc-like structures called thylakoids, which are surrounded by a fluid-filled space called the stroma. The reactions that synthesize glucose, the Calvin cycle, occur in the stroma. The light-dependent reactions occur in the thylakoid. It is here that conversion of light energy to chemical energy is initiated.
So let's begin by talking about the light reaction. And the main goal of the light reaction is to capture energy from the sun and store it in other molecules. We'll then use these higher powered molecules for the carbon reactions in the next step. The light reactions occur in the thylakoids of the chloroplast, and we'll look at the major events before we go into more detail. So what we'll see is that photosystems within the thylakoids of the chloroplast absorb energy from the sun, and in a multi-step process, they're going to store the energy from the sun in NADPH and some ATP. The NADPH and the ATP are the higher powered molecules that are required for the carbon reactions. We'll also see in the light reactions that water is split into hydrogen ions, H+, which are protons, and oxygen. The oxygen will be released to the atmosphere through stomata, and we could then breathe in that oxygen as animals. But something interesting happens with these hydrogen ions. The hydrogen ions are pumped inside the thylakoid membrane to create a gradient meaning a difference in pH. And we know that a gradient is a form of potential energy. So we could use this potential energy from the pH gradient to make chemical energy of ATP. So we'll talk a lot more about this in a bit. It's a little more complicated. But we're going to make ATP using a pH gradient created by protons that were split by sunlight in water, right? So what we needed, obviously, was light energy and water in order to do all this. And what we're going to get out is ATP, NADPH, and, of course, some oxygen. So just to review, this is happening in the chloroplasts, specifically the thylakoid membranes. So energy from sunlight will be absorbed, water molecules will be broken down, oxygen will be released, and ATP and NADPH will be made available for the next part of photosynthesis. So photosynthesis begins in the cluster of pigment molecules of photosystem 2. So it might seem illogical, but the photosystems that were first discovered was actually photosystem 1. But photosystem 2 is where photosynthesis actually begins. So light from the sun will be absorbed by the chlorophyll in photosystem 2. And chlorophyll will absorb that light energy and transfer it to a special pair of electrons. Those excited electrons can then move to an electron transport chain in the thylakoid membrane. We'll talk a lot more about that. And at the same time, water molecules are being broken down by sunlight, H2O, right? And we have 3 parts of H2O now after it's being broken down by sunlight. The hydrogen electrons are used to replenish those lost by chlorophyll. So then we have the electrons going here. The hydrogen protons, H+, will be transported into the thylakoid using energy from the electron transport chain. That's very important, right? We're pumping H+'s inside the thylakoid membrane. And finally, oxygen is released as gas. So let's talk about the electron transport chain more closely. So the electron transport chain, or ETC, is a series of thylakoid membrane proteins that can pass along excited electrons, almost like hot potato, releasing energy with each step. And the electron transport chain, again, is as electrons are being passed, protons are being pumped into the thylakoid against the concentration gradient. So as electrons are being passed from one protein to the next, hydrogen protons are going from low concentration to high concentration against the concentration gradient. And this concentration gradient will be very important in a bit. So what we're doing is we excited electrons in chlorophyll, right? We had a photon of light. It bounced through the antenna pigments. It hit this reaction center chlorophyll. The special pair of electrons in the reaction center chlorophyll get excited, and then they get passed along from protein to protein. Right? And as that happens from protein to protein, then protons can be pumped inside of the thylakoid space. So that's what we have so far. We have a lot of protons in the thylakoid. Now we have something happening at photosystem 1. So those low energy electrons that just went through the electron transport chain will then be passed to a different chlorophyll pigment in photosystem 1. And photosystem 1 functions very similarly to photosystem 2. But at the end of photosystem 1, it's actually a different wavelength of light that is absorbed in photosystem 1. The electrons that get energized in this chlorophyll are used to make NADPH. So remember, NADP plus is a cofactor. It's like an energy carrier. It's like the empty, uncharged battery. So we can use these excited electrons from photosystem 1, and NADP plus can hold onto it and become the higher powered NADPH. And NADPH is needed in the next phase of the carbon reaction. So that's what happens at photosystem 1. We're making NADPH. We use those electrons directly to reduce NADP plus into NADPH. So now let's finish up with the light reaction. Remember all of those H pluses that we just pumped into the thylakoid, right? Using the energy from the electrons that were energized in photosystem 2. Well, these hydrogen ions will now flow through a special channel in the thylakoid membrane going down the concentration gradient, right? They're going from where they're very high concentration to very low concentration. And a really, really important enzyme called ATP synthase could transform the the potential energy in this gradient into chemical energy of ATP. So ATP synthase is incredibly important, and we're going to see how it works in just a bit. So ADP can be changed into ATP when hydrogen ions flow through ATP synthase. So again, we're using potential energy to drive the formation of a different kind of energy. So what is the source of protons that are pumped across the membrane? Do you remember this? You can pause here, and the answer is B, water. So ATP synthase makes ATP from ADP and phosphate as part of the light reactions. And the proton gradient is what drives the spinning of ATP synthase. So as H pluses inside the thylakoid go from high concentration to low concentration, this actually spins as a form of kinetic energy. Right? So the potential energy of the gradient drives the kinetic energy movement of the enzyme. This method of producing ATP is called chemiosmosis because ATP production is tied to the establishment of a gradient, right? An osmotic gradient. So we have something flowing from high concentration to low concentration, and that powers ATP. That powers the phosphorylation of ADP to make the high-powered ATP. So it's called chemiosmosis or chemiosmotic phosphorylation. The same process will happen in cellular respiration. So it's going to be very important. So it's good to establish the concept from now. So I just want to watch a quick video with you to illustrate some of the processes we just learned about. So again, we're inside the thylakoid membrane. A photon from the sun can excite a special electron within chlorophyll. To replace that electron that gets excited, water gets split by light. And again, we have another electron that can then be excited. And electrons are passed along the electron transport chain in the thylakoid membrane. So proteins pass these high energy electrons from one protein to the next. And as they do so, they can pump hydrogens from where they are low concentration to high concentration. So we're getting hydrogens pumped against the concentration gradient. So again, as those electrons are being energized and passed along the electron transport chain, we're going to accumulate hydrogens inside the thylakoid space. At photosystem 1, the electron will then be energized by a different wavelength of light, but this time the electron is being used to reduce NADP plus into NADPH, which is like the higher powered form. So at the end, we have NADPH. And that's from photosystem 1. And photosystem 2 established the pH gradient that can then be used to power ATP synthase. So one more time we can review. Photosystem 2, again, has a special chlorophyll. The electrons within chlorophyll will be excited. Those electrons will then be replenished by those from water. Those electrons are passed along the electron transport chain in the thylakoid membrane, and then hydrogens can be pumped inside the thylakoid to create a gradient. The electron is re-energized at photosystem 1, and those high energy electrons are then added to NADP plus to make NADPH. Finally, all of those H pluses that accumulated in the thylakoid could go down the concentration gradient through a special protein called ATP synthase. So this is an enzyme that can convert ADP into ATP by chemiosmotic phosphorylation. So it's adding a phosphate to ADP using osmosis, right, flowing from high concentration to low concentration. So how do the light reactions produce ATP? So pause here and try your best to answer the question. So the answer to this question is A. Potential energy stored in a hydrogen ion gradient is used to synthesize ATP. Which of the following can accept a pair of electrons? All right, so pause here. And the answer is C. NADP plus can be reduced into NADPH. I'd like you to pause here to see a simplified view of the light reactions. I'd also like you to watch the video in the ebook that goes into a little more detail of the light reactions. And finally, let's watch one more video before we move on to the second half of photosynthesis.
In most photosynthetic organisms, thylakoids contain pairs of photosystems, called photosystem 1 and photosystem 2, that work in tandem to produce the energy that will later be used in the stroma to manufacture sugars. The photosystems of the thylakoid consist of a network of accessory pigment molecules and chlorophyll, the molecules that absorb the photons of light. Within the pigment molecules, The absorbed light energy excites electrons to a higher state. Photosystems will channel the excitation energy gathered by the pigment molecules to a reaction center chlorophyll molecule, which will then pass the electrons to a series of proteins located on the thylakoid membrane. Photons of light strike photosystems 1 and 2 simultaneously. We will examine what happens with the photons striking photosystem 2 first. The energized electrons are passed from the reaction center of photosystem 2 to an electron transport chain. The electrons lost by photosystem 2 are replaced by a process called photolysis, which involves the oxidation of a water molecule producing free electrons and oxygen gas. While this oxygen gas is a byproduct of photosynthesis, it is an important input to the cellular respiration pathways. As electrons pass through the electron transport chain, the energy from the electron is used to pump hydrogen ions from the stroma to the thylakoid, creating a concentration gradient. This gradient powers a protein called ATP synthase, which phosphorylates ADP to form ATP. The low-energy electrons leaving photosystem 2 are shuttled to photosystem 1. Within photosystem 1, low-energy electrons are re-energized and are passed through an electron transport chain where they are used to reduce the electron carrier NADP+ to NADPH.
So now we are at step 2, the Calvin cycle or the carbon reactions. So the carbon reactions are called the Calvin cycle because of Melvin Calvin, who discovered this reaction. And in this reaction, we're making carbohydrates from carbon dioxide using the ATP and NADPH we made from the light reactions. So basically, we're going to take the higher powered ATP and NADPH and use the energy so we can reduce carbon dioxide into carbohydrates. Right. So Calvin cycle is also known as carbon reactions, also known as C3 photosynthesis, a lot of different names. This is occurring in the stroma of the chloroplasts, not the thylakoid. We get CO2 from the atmosphere, shown here, and then we have ATP and NADPH from the light reactions, and the outputs are carbohydrates. Right. This is a very, very good diagram to memorize. That shows the interplay of the two reactions. So, which is not an input into the Calvin cycle. We know water is not needed in the Calvin cycle at all, whereas CO2, ATP, and NADPH all are required for the Calvin cycle, also known as the carbon reactions. So, the carbon reactions or the Calvin cycle starts when CO2, carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, is attached to a 5-carbon sugar by the enzyme RUBP carboxylase, also known as Rubisco. So Rubisco is the enzyme that catalyzes this first reaction where CO2 from the atmosphere is added to a 5-carbon molecule. Rubisco is actually an essential component of every plant and is the most abundant protein on Earth. So now what we have first was a 6-carbon molecule. The 6-carbon molecule, right, was 5 carbons plus 1 from CO2. So the 6-carbon molecule splits into 2 3-carbon molecules called phosphoglycerate. Those phosphoglycerate molecules then become reduced by ATP and NADPH to form phosphoglyceraldehyde. And phosphoglyceraldehyde, also known as PGAL or glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, G3P, that's what can actually form sugars, and like glucose. Again, I just said a lot of names, so I'm going to go back. First step is CO2 from the atmosphere is added to a 5-carbon sugar by the enzyme Rubisco. So we have a 6-carbon sugar. The 6-carbon sugar gets split into 2 3-carbon molecules. Each of those 3-carbon molecules can be reduced by ATP and NADPH, that is energy, and that can turn it into a higher powered 3-carbon molecule called PGAL, also known as G3P. In different books, you'll see it written different ways. I know it's not convenient. CO2 is now considered fixed. This is called carbon fixation because it is now part of a carbohydrate, right? It wasn't usable. It was not that it was broken, but it wasn't usable in the atmosphere. But now it's fixed because it can be used by the cell to build larger carbohydrates like glucose and sucrose. Some can even be made into cellulose that can build cell walls. So the ATP and the NADPH produced in the light reactions provide the potential energy and the electrons necessary to reduce CO2. So as long as ATP and NADPH are plentiful, the Calvin cycle can continually fix carbon from the atmosphere into small organic molecules. Those molecules can then be formed into sugars and even proteins and oils. So this is an image from the book. Now let's watch a quick video together.
When the chloroplast is receiving a steady supply of photons, NADPH and ATP molecules are rapidly being provided to the metabolic pathways in the stroma. Therefore, the ATP and NADPH formed during the light-dependent reactions are used in the stroma to fuel the Calvin cycle reactions. The Calvin cycle consists of a series of reactions that reduce carbon dioxide to produce the carbohydrate glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. The cycle consists of 3 steps, the first of which is carbon fixation. In this step, carbon dioxide is attached to ribulose 1,5-bisphosphate, resulting in a 6-carbon molecule that splits into 2 3-carbon molecules. The second step is a sequence of reactions using electrons from NADPH and some of the ATP to reduce carbon dioxide. In the final step, ribulose 1,5-bisphosphate is regenerated. For every 3 turns of the cycle, 5 molecules of glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate are used to reform 3 molecules of ribulose 1,5-bisphosphate.
So glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate can have many different fates. So glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, also known as PGAL, right, same thing, can be turned into glucose, but also fatty acids or amino acids. So this is how plants can grow just by using the sun for photosynthesis. So remember G3P, glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, is the same thing as saying phosphoglyceraldehyde, PGAL. So as an overview, we saw that solar energy from the sun and water were required for the light reactions. ADP and NADP+ were also inputs. And as outputs, we got NADPH, ATP, and oxygen. That NADPH and ATP was fed into the Calvin cycle reactions, the carbon reactions. And carbon dioxide was an input, and carbon dioxide was fixed, meaning it was incorporated into organic molecules that can then be built into sugars, fatty acids, and amino acids. So take a second to pause here and see if you can answer this rapid response question before we finish up. So the answer to this question is B. A plant cell uses the ATP from the light reactions to fuel the carbon reactions. So plants use different carbon fixation pathways. We've been studying the Calvin cycle so far, which is known as the C3 pathway, because a 3-carbon molecule, PGA, is the first stable compound in the pathway. So although all plants use the Calvin cycle, C3 plants use only this pathway to fix carbon from CO2. So about 95% of plant species are C3 plants. And it's a very good adaptation, but it does have a downside. So this sycamore tree that lives in cool, moist environments is perfectly fine doing mostly C3 environments. But plants in hot climates have to use alternate pathways for carbon fixation. Each of these alternate pathways, called C4 and CAM, has its own advantages and disadvantages. So it just depends on the environment of the plant, and that determines which type of carbon reactions it's going to use to make its sugar. So C3 plants like the sycamore tree do light reactions and the Calvin cycle in the same cell, in mesophyll cells. So we have the mesophyll cells are going to use the carbon dioxide to make sugar. Remember, the carbon dioxide has to enter through stomata on the other side of the leaves. But when it's very hot and dry out, the stomata should not be open because then water will leave and the plants will wilt and probably die. So in hot, dry weather, C3 plants close their stomata to prevent any water from leaving. But that creates an issue. Photorespiration occurs because oxygen continues to build up inside the leaf because it can't leave. And when oxygen accumulates inside of the leaf, that decreases the efficiency of the Calvin cycle. It actually competes with carbon dioxide for rubisco. And that really wastes a lot of ATP and NADPH with photorespiration. So again, plants, C3 plants specifically, shut their stomata when it's hot out to prevent water loss, but as a result, they don't do a very efficient photosynthesis when it's hot and dry out. So plants in drier climates have adapted to avoid photorespiration. So they do C3 photosynthesis, they do the Calvin cycle, but they also do another type of cycle. So C4 plants and CAM plants have adapted to hot and dry weather. C4 and CAM plants divide up the two steps of photosynthesis, meaning the light reactions and the carbon cycle, either by the location or by the time of day in which those reactions occur. So C4 plants perform the carbon reactions in a separate location in order to avoid photorespiration. So they do carbon reactions away from the stomata in a separate location, so there's no threat of oxygen building up. The light reactions occur in mesophyll cells, and they're arranged quite differently in a C4 plant. The Calvin cycle occurs in bundle sheath cells. So even if the stomata are closed, if it's a very hot, dry day out and there is oxygen accumulation, the oxygen cannot interfere with the Calvin cycle because the Calvin cycle occurs in a separate location within these bundle sheath cells. So the stomata could be closed and sugars can still be produced without photorespiration in C4 plants. CAM plants have adapted differently. They divide up the labor by time. So many desert plants like cacti are CAM plants, and those do all the reactions of photosynthesis in mesophyll cells like C3 plants. However, they only do the Calvin cycle at night. So the Calvin cycle, which requires carbon dioxide, will have the stomata open only at night when there's no dry air that will dehydrate the plants. So stomata are closed during the day when it's very hot out, so there's no water loss. But when the night comes and the heat is a lot lower, the stomata open to allow carbon dioxide in and oxygen out. And photorespiration does not reduce the efficiency of photosynthesis. So this is a very good overview of the alternate pathways of photosynthesis. So try to see if you can answer all of these questions, and then try to troubleshoot where you need to go into more detail. Here are some answers to that cheat sheet found in the learning map. And finally, to conclude, let's overview the photosynthesis concept map. So photosynthesis occurs in two stages. The photo part is the light reaction. Water is the electron source for the light reactions. Light is the energy source for the light reactions. And the light reactions produce ATP and NADPH. They release oxygen as a waste product. That ATP from the light reactions is an energy source for the carbon reactions, and the NADPH is an electron source for the carbon reactions. The carbon reactions produce sugar, specifically pGal, which can make more than sugar. It can make proteins and fats and oils as well. And in order for the carbon reactions to occur, we need a carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So that is the end of Chapter 5, Photosynthesis. Next time, we will talk about cellular respiration. Right? So what happens with the sugars that the plants just made? So until next time, have a good day.